Hello, and you're very welcome to the Health Research Podcast, where today we're talking about the gaps in research into women's health. I'm your host, Dr. Claire O'Connell, and in this series we explore how research and evidence can shape better policies to help everyone, that's service users, communities and society at large. And in studio today, we have Professor Susan Smith, who is Professor of General Practice at Trinity College Dublin. And we have Dr. Jane Murphy, who is a researcher at the Health Research Board here in Ireland. And joining us online is Dr. Linda Biesty, who is Associate Professor in Midwifery at the University of Galway. You are all very welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
So today we are focusing largely on a newly published piece of work, a report by the Health Research Board, which identified substantial gaps in women's health research in OECD countries, including Ireland. Now, to give the report its full title, it is Women's Health Treatment Interventions and Outcomes, an Evidence and Gap Map Review. And I'm delighted to say that one of the co-authors of the review is here to tell us more. So, Dr. Jane Murphy, congratulations to you and your colleagues on a really excellent and comprehensive and timely piece of work. Can you tell us about the top-line findings?
Yeah, so this was a global review looking at research conducted from Ireland but also across 38 OECD countries. And in particular, we looked at what studies exist on 10 categories of female health conditions and what studies exist evaluating a range of different interventions to treat those conditions. So in terms of the interventions we looked at medical, psychological interventions, physical therapy, complementary and alternative therapies, and some of the health conditions we looked at are gynecological cancers and gynecological conditions, pelvic floor disorders, prolapse, infertility, early pregnancy loss, postpartum mental health and menopausal symptoms as well. And of the 10 categories that we looked at, we found that 4 in particular have limited evidence, and they are pelvic organ prolapse, pelvic and vulvar vaginosis, early pregnancy loss and postpartum mental health.
And Jane, can you explain a little bit more about why you wanted to use this approach in particular?
So this was the Department of Health asked us to conduct this report, and it was based on the National Women's Health Action Plan that's in place. So that action plan acknowledges that there's several gaps in our knowledge of women's health, and it also aims to grow the evidence base for women's health research in Ireland.
And it's a huge piece of work. I mean, you looked at more than 2,000 studies, absolutely enormous. It must have taken some time to do it. But the findings were focusing, as you say, you were looking at the gaps in the research. You weren't particularly looking at what are the outcomes, what are the interventions. You were looking to see, is the research being done, and finding these gaps there. So, Linda and Susan, I'm curious to hear about your observations on the report. Linda, what were your thoughts?
So what's particularly interesting from my point of view as a researcher, but probably more especially as the clinician, is where those gaps are and how those gaps therefore then influence the guidelines, the care that we offer to people and to women. We speak about evidence-informed care, evidence-based care. We speak about our guidelines being informed so that we ensure the care that we're offering to the best of our ability. So where there are gaps in evidence, then there's obviously gaps in how evidence-informed our care is.
And Susan, what are your observations on the report's general findings?
Well, I was incredibly impressed by the thoroughness of the work that went into it. So well done. And I was very glad to be involved as a kind of a clinical academic advisor throughout the process. So I'm very confident in the process itself. And it did exactly as it set out to do. It identified gaps in evidence. And as Linda says, that means we have gaps in policy and care delivery, which I think is really important that we consider to address. Now, it doesn't tell us what exact research we should do, but it sets the scene for what's the next step.
Right, because I think we hear anecdotally a lot that women's health is not researched to the same extent that other areas of health are, and it's super to have some evidence now pointing to the areas that need to be strengthened. But before we go deeper into the findings, can you put us in the picture a little bit about what an evidence and gap map is? So, Linda, what's an evidence and gap map?
An evidence gap map is a type of evidence synthesis that can answer broad questions that are where evidence exists on a particular topic, and exactly as it says on the tin, where the gap is in relation to that evidence. So it's broader than a systematic review. It gives us the ability to synthesize a large number of studies that maybe will contribute then to a strategic approach to identify and address prioritized evidence areas. The things that I find particularly useful about an evidence gap map is that we're not just presenting narrative findings. Those of us who've been doing research for a long time produce these huge reports that aren't always accessible. They aren't always accessible to the end user, be that a person in receipt of care, be that a policymaker, be that a clinician. So with an evidence gap map, we also produce a visual representation of where the gaps are, as Jane and the team have done in relation to this review. And that can be really accessible. It makes it really real at a glance, and it gives people the opportunity to perhaps engage when they wouldn't engage with the couple of 100 pages of reports that researchers traditionally produce.
Brilliant. And the review did find that several conditions are under-researched globally and in Ireland. And you mentioned a few at the start there. They include pelvic organ prolapse and mental health after giving birth. Susan, can I ask you, what do these gaps mean for women in practice?
I was surprised about the postpartum mental health. To be honest, because it is such a common issue. About 15-17% of women experience postnatal mental health problems. So it is a bit alarming that there's such a gap in researching that. The pelvic organ prolapse, again, is interesting because it's very common, but I think women tolerate a lot of symptoms and they put it down to, well, that's what you expect as you get older, So I now it's quite complex because there's overlaps with different types of pelvic symptoms and different bits of organs prolapsing, so it's a hard area to define and to research. And I think you found that, Jane, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they're both common things in clinical practice, and therefore it's important that we know there isn't a lot of research being done on them.
Right, okay. Another condition that affects a lot of women is endometriosis. And we've been hearing recently in Ireland and the UK about the lack of availability of treatments for endometriosis. And, research would show that endometriosis is one of those conditions that is, relatively common and underfunded relative to how common it is. So how does this research imbalance affect the care of women who have endometriosis? Actually, can you first remind us what endometriosis is?
It's a kind of a gynecological condition where you get growth of cells that should be inside your uterus in other parts of your body, usually around the pelvis. So it could be affecting your ovaries or your fallopian tubes. So it can then be associated with a lot of pelvic pain during your cycle or infertility. One of the challenges is it's one of these disorders where there's a spectrum of abnormality, and there's probably quite a few women who have mild endometriosis and maybe they think they just have very, very bad period pain or whatever. They conceive, so they're never investigated. And then, of course, there's the other extreme end where it has a huge effect on daily function and on fertility. And the real challenge clinically is that it can be very hard early on to distinguish between what is a normally bad period and what is one that is pathological, particularly in younger women and adolescents who often have quite, heavy period pain and difficulties. So it's interesting. One of the things we may touch on later is next steps. And one of the things you can do is you can do these things called priority setting partnerships with patients. And this research would be a brilliant basis for such an exercise with women about what would they like to prioritise. But there is one has been done on endometriosis in the UK, in Edinburgh. And one of the priorities they identified was some kind of an early screening test to detect women who have it. So there's so many opportunities to research it that could make quite a difference for people.
And what did you find, Jane, when you looked at the over 2,000 studies about endometriosis in particular?
Yeah, so we didn't look at the availability of treatments as such. We looked at what research has been conducted on a range of different interventions to treat endometriosis. So we looked at what research is done on medical and psychological interventions, physical therapy, complementary and alternative therapies. And within those areas, we found approximately 200 studies that have been conducted on endometriosis over the last 5-year period. But of those 200 studies, approximately 140 are protocols of ongoing research. So they're not yet completed. So there's more evidence in progress on the condition rather than completed evidence. So I suppose that means we can expect more evidence to come on the condition, which is promising.
That's good. There's kind of a pipeline there, maybe. Okay, great. And Linda, I suppose as you're an associate professor of midwifery and a clinician, so were you surprised as well, maybe by the paucity of evidence, particularly around mental health and well-being in that period after birth?
Hugely, absolutely hugely. And I think Susan has already alluded to the fact, thankfully, this is an area that we are now beginning to address and speak to and acknowledge more than perhaps we would have done in previous generations of women birthing and offering care to them. So the fact that we still are identifying a gap in relation to interventions to support this need of women postnatally was really surprising to me. And I think something that priority setting partnership exercise that Susan referred to will be interested going forward in the next stages of this research, where to go to next, what's important. And I would imagine that's going to be one area that's going to be hugely important to prioritise.
Yeah, and impactful for people as well. So Jane, one of the areas that you mentioned that is underrepresented in research in the evidence and gap map is early pregnancy loss. So this is the loss of a pregnancy before 20 weeks. Can you talk us through a little bit about what you found about that condition?
Yeah, so we looked at a number of kind of specific conditions within that category that can occur within the first half of pregnancy, so up to 20-week mark. So we included conditions like septic abortion, threatened abortion, ectopic pregnancy, miscarriage, and overall these conditions are lacking in evidence. For example, we found no eligible studies on septic abortion. Now, that might be because it's a condition that needs to be very urgently treated. Typically, within a patient being identified as high risk, they need to be treated within the hour, which can make it very difficult to research in a planned research study. But even, all of the other conditions in this category are certainly under-researched, and there's a clear evidence gap there.
And it's a hugely upsetting time for people and families going through this. Susan, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, again, it's a little bit like the postpartum depression. It's surprising because it's so common. Most women will experience an early pregnancy loss in their life, is the reality. And it's distressing, even if you've got children already or whatever. And it's particularly if, it's your first pregnancy or it's been a hard to achieve pregnancy. And I don't think we talk about it enough. And maybe that's partly why it's also not researched enough. It's not something that people share widely. And we still have this kind of idea, don't tell anyone until you're 12 or 14 weeks because you're not really sure. And that means that there's going to be less focus on this area as well. It's a little bit taboo.
So again, is it an area we need to prioritise with the consultation of people who maybe have experienced it or are at risk?
Yeah. Well, Jane mentioned one of the markers for prioritisation is also about prevalence of things. Is that we should be looking at things that are very common, and that is obviously something that is very common.
I suppose in terms of the evidence and gap map review that was done by the HRB at the behest of the Department of Health, how does it align with international efforts like the World Health Organization strategy on women's health and well-being in Europe? Where does it fit into that bigger picture?
So I think the WHO strategy calls on national governments to improve healthcare policies and health systems and to make sure that they're sex responsive. So I think this review is a key first step in doing that. It identifies where the evidence is, where the evidence gaps are, so that we can now focus on those areas and consider them in future research. So I think it responds to that as Ireland's approach to considering what the evidence gaps are and filling those gaps with new research.
Because other countries, such as Wales and Norway, have done an exercise am I right in thinking perhaps not as comprehensively, but they have looked at evidence and gap maps? So how does the Irish picture compare there?
Yeah, so the HRB evidence and gap map is a lot more comprehensive. We looked at 10 categories of health conditions. We looked at the ongoing research, as well as primary trials that have tested if these interventions work. And we looked at secondary evidence. So we looked at systematic reviews. So we kind of covered all bases with ongoing primary and secondary research. Whereas maps conducted by Wales and Norway were, of course, extremely beneficial, but they only looked at, say, primary evidence or secondary evidence on a fewer selection of women's health conditions. So I think our report can add to those, as it's more comprehensive.
And within the OECD countries, of which Ireland is one, and this was what the review covered, again, sort of, where does Ireland rank in terms of the evidence and gap map? Did anything stand out to you from that?
The evidence gaps are pretty much consistent between Ireland and the other OECD countries. The evidence gaps were on those 4 conditions, but across all contexts and in Ireland specifically. So it's very much consistent with those other countries.
Okay. And in terms of strengthening the research in these areas, which is very much needed, I mean, Linda, I suppose, as someone who's not involved in trial design or study design, things like that, it seems that it might be quite easy to report things like the sex of the participants. Does that tend to happen? Is that something that researchers can easily incorporate into their work and thereby start to generate the evidence that we need?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll find, and Jane will allude to this, that is something that prior to now hasn't been well reported, which seems phenomenal. And we have done, through some of our exercises for more inclusive trial methodology, developed some guidelines in relation to what should be reported to ensure that we can identify the inclusivity or not of trials that we're including within our reviews. So that might not just relate to sex and gender, but ethnicity, socioeconomic groupings, so that we're ensuring that our trials are designed and developed to be more inclusive of those to whom they will be offered as guidance and care, the findings.
Okay, very good. And core outcomes is another thing that I know you're very strong on, Linda. Can you explain to us what core outcomes are and how important it is for researchers to include it in study design?
Yeah. So a core outcome set is an agreed, standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported on in any trial for any specific condition. And when I say agreed, I don't just mean that they should be, plucked from thin air by the researchers. This should follow a process where all of those with a key interest held in the condition, clinicians, researchers, patients, the public, those offering care to patients or support to patients' lives, should identify a minimum lift that they deem to be most important to measure across interventions of trials within this space. And there's a couple of reasons why that's really important, but probably primarily it's so that we can ensure that there are common outcomes measured across individual trials that we can then synthesize within our reviews. And by synthesize, I mean bring together the findings across more than one trial to enhance our body of evidence that exists in relation to interventions aligned to a certain condition. It's important that when we are developing a core outcome set or when we are presenting a core outcome set to the community, that those designing and developing trials realise that, this is the minimum set of outcomes. If they want to add additional outcomes aligned to their study, that's absolutely fine. But these are the minimum set of outcomes that we would wish them to include in any of their research. And again, different core outcome set development is at different phases within certain conditions. So we'll find women's health, midwifery, maternity, gynae care, where we're catching up perhaps with some other conditions. But it's really important so that going further, we can make wider sense of the study, not just that study in isolation.
Okay, so this is something where the design of a study means that if it's designed in a certain way, in a kind of a standardized way, and if it reports things like the sex or gender of participants, it means that it can be incorporated into that wider research and evidence, which then translates into policy and practice, which hopefully translates into better outcomes for women. Is that, am I correct?
Yeah, and the other thing that's really important about core outcome sets is that you include the patients and the public in designing them.
Sure.
So they kind of originated in the area of rheumatology, where there was a lot of trials, but the outcomes were all very kind of biomedical. And the patient group said, actually, we don't really care about whatever our level of X is. We want you to measure our quality of life and our pain. And so that the outcomes then become standardised, but also much more relevant to patients.
Right.
And therefore also maybe to policymakers. Policymakers can also contribute, and they may care about things like days in hospital or, there's so many different perspectives on what should be outcomes for different research.
Sure. Because I know as a scientist myself, sometimes you're very zoned in on, there's that interesting biomarker, but the person actually wants to, play with their grandkids, or the policymaker doesn't want the hospital beds all full.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Very, very important. So I suppose looking ahead, Ireland's Women's Health Action Plan specifically aims to address the historical underrepresentation of women in health research by increasing the evidence in clinical and academic and applied research. So now that we have this map, this wonderful map that the HRB has produced, how could its findings lead to women being more appropriately represented in health research and healthcare? I know that's a huge question, but I'm keen to hear all your answers on it. Jane?
Yeah, I might start with some of the next steps that can be taken based on these findings, and then some steps that are already being taken. So firstly, as I've mentioned, the report points to those 4 categories of conditions. So just to say them again, it's prolapse, vaginosis, early pregnancy loss, and postpartum mental health. And I think the next step would be to, as Susan said, consider input from clinical specialists, patients living with the condition, to determine which of those conditions we need to prioritise, how we need to research them, and consider things like how prevalent and how common they are, or how severe or treatable they are in making that decision. So I think that would be a key next step. And based on the evidence gaps, there is some work ongoing already. So the Department of Health have now requested us in the HRB Evidence Centre to conduct a review looking at how well psychological interventions can treat postpartum mental health. So that work is already ongoing. And I think, as well as identifying evidence gaps, the report also identifies conditions that have a larger evidence base, so where more research exists. And it's important to look at the quality of that evidence as well, to see, okay, these conditions are more researched, but do we need more high quality work? And we're collaborating with a research team in RCSI in the Royal College of Surgeons, who are looking at some of the conditions that we identified as more researched than others, to assess the quality of those studies. So they're looking at trials on ovarian cancer and stress urinary incontinence, and that's ongoing as well.
That's brilliant to hear. Those next steps are already being taken. That's wonderful. Linda, what are your thoughts on next steps to make sure that women are more appropriately represented in health research and care?
I think I keep going back to priority setting exercises in my head. I keep going back to ensuring that we align our identification of priority areas in a way that invites and includes the voices of all, not just clinicians, not just policymakers, and not just researchers, that we need those in receipt of our care. And the priority setting exercise, for example, the James Linda Lyons methodology, really speaks to doing that, and gives everybody the opportunity to say what's important to them, what's useful, where we should focus our energies, our time, our research, and our resources. because otherwise we're just in a little vacuum going round in a circle if we don't include wider everybody's voice in identifying those priorities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Susan, what do you think are the important next steps?
Well, I think it's important for us to acknowledge, and the report definitely acknowledges this, that this report is about conditions that affect women from biologically at birth. But actually, we need also to be aware, and we've kind of touched on it, about gender representation in research and sex representation, because actually things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other broader things, arthritis, depression, actually have profound effects on women's lives as well as these other conditions. So I think what's brilliant about this is it shines the light on women's health and research into women's health. But I think we need to consider, well, actually, they also have more, the impacts of diabetes or cardiovascular disease or lung cancer or whatever it is. That there's overwhelming evidence that they get less care, they're less included in trials, there's less reporting of women's outcomes in trials. And then the other thing I think we need to be very aware of is this idea of intersectionality, that not all women are equal. So a woman from a very disadvantaged community has less access to care, poorer health outcomes than an affluent woman. And both maybe have less access and better outcomes than men. And then ethnicity comes into it. And there's one really good example. There's been so much stuff about menopause and HRT recently. And I read in the last few months a report that women from the most disadvantaged groups in the UK are half as likely to be in receipt of HRT than in the most affluent. And so that's quite a stark difference.
Right. Yeah.
And certainly in an Irish context, that's down to access to general practice, and also the GPs working in the most disadvantaged areas are overwhelmed by dealing with so much other stuff that they may be less likely to engage in menopause work. Now, I'm involved in a group of GPs called the Deep End Group that the department are currently funding, and we have actually had funding through the Women's Health Initiative for a menopause pilot in urban deprived general practices. So that's really important, that those issues, that if we want really effective interventions and better outcomes, we have to target the people who are currently the most vulnerable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Linda, is this again where having core outcome sets and more granular reporting, I suppose, about participants, can that help everybody?
Yes, in a nutshell, absolutely.
Good.
How can it not? Because then we can begin to make sense of the evidence and how to apply it and where it fits in certain contexts and for certain people. And and that needs to be evident in our reporting, or we're not. It's that application piece then that we can then enhance and make more robust.
We're losing the valuable data that could help create the evidence to improve outcomes. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to our guests for joining us on the podcast today. You know, sometimes you have to be aware of what's needed in order to generate the evidence that we need for better healthcare, for better outcomes. So thank you so much to Professor Susan Smith, Dr. Jane Murphy and Dr. Linda Biesty. And that's it for this episode of the Health Research Podcast. You can listen to all episodes on major podcast platforms and on video on the Health Research Board YouTube channel. Links to audio and video versions are also available on our website at hrb.ie. This podcast is a production of the Health Research Board, Ireland's state agency for conducting and funding health and social care research.